So you see the scene here in the Gospel of Luke. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the other Jewish leaders, the people who were in the synagogue had become so comfortable waiting for the arrival of the Messiah. Now this is the state they were in. They were anticipating the coming of the Messiah. And so as they're waiting for the Messiah to come, they're so comfortable waiting for the Messiah to arrive that they didn't even recognize him when he was right in front of them. They didn't even recognize him. In their extreme comfort with their situation, their station in life, they were unable to see Jesus for who he was and what he represented. They missed the point. They were involved in church. They were involved in religion, organized religion. But they missed the point for which they had gathered and organized. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. This is how the scene starts. And a physically handicapped woman is there, and Jesus heals her. These are the events of this story. First, he verbally heals her, and then physically she is restored. And at that point, as it says in this passage, a leader stands up and addresses the crowd. I can just picture him. There are 6 days, come on. There are 6 days, you guys. You know there are 6 days to come and be healed. This is the Sabbath day. This isn't the day for that. You got to get with the program. We have healing those other days. He doesn't address Jesus. How often is that the case when somebody has a conflict with another person? Instead of going to that person, obviously the synagogue leader had not read Matthew 18, where it talks about how it is the appropriate way to address another person within the church with whom you have a conflict. You go directly to that person and say, hey, listen, it really, I don't think this works for us to have this healing on the Sabbath. And then if the person says, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway, you take another person with you and say, so that you have a witness. I don't think this is good. There's this whole way of addressing, and that's not just scriptural, that's common human decency. I think in this century what we would call, what the religious leader was doing is called passive-aggressive. He was passive-aggressively addressing Jesus. He didn't want to talk directly to him. He was going to talk to the people. The interesting thing is the lady who was healed didn't even ask to be healed. We have a history of not working on the Sabbath. I've heard people say, I don't want to do it, but I had to mow the lawn on Sunday because it had been raining, it was supposed to rain tomorrow, and so I had to go ahead and do it. It's like, really? That's what the Sabbath law is about, you think? There's this long tradition. Of course, it's the fourth commandment. Exodus 20, verse 8 says, observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. But it's more than that. It's richer than that. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's this document called the Damascus Covenant. And it says, and I'm not going to read the whole section on Sabbath laws, but it says, and on the Sabbath day, no one shall speak a foolish and empty word. I wonder how many preachers that would shut up. Present company included. Lend nothing. Make no plan concerning wealth and profit. No plan concerning wealth and profit. Okay, got that one. Speak no word in matters of business or work to be done in the next day. Have we ever had a business meeting on Sunday? This is great. It's great reading this because it's like, how often do we pick the places we want to agree and then cast aside the ones that that doesn't work for me. It goes on and it describes the kind of work in very specific detail that are prohibited on the Sabbath. Another example comes from the Mishnah Shabbat, which is a rabbinic definition of what work specifically has to not be done on the Sabbath. And it uses classic Jewish prose. The basic tasks are 40 less 1. Sowing, planting, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing and winnowing, polishing and grinding grain, sifting, kneading and breaking, and it goes on and on and on in intricate detail, the 40 minus 1 tasks. So what are we to think? Was Jesus breaking the law? watering animals is necessary for their survival. You can't say to the ox who didn't agree to be a member of this religious group that doesn't allow work on Saturdays, you can't have water today. My dog has a great way of finding water if I forget to fill the water dish. First he'll lick the dry bowl, but then there are other basins of water in the house that he'll go look to. And you hear it and you think, oh no! Animals need water for survival, but this woman had been sick for 18 years. Why did she have to wait till Sunday? Well, I'm saying Sunday, but it was the Sabbath, Saturday. But why did she have to wait until that day? But then again, she didn't ask to be healed. She just came to the synagogue, perhaps to sing joyful, joyful. We have rules, right? We all have rules. Some rules are really good. Some rules help keep us safe. Drive on the right-hand side of the road. I mean, if we stop doing that, then it gets to be fairly chaotic and dangerous on the road. So there are rules that we don't even question, because we want everyone else to do that too. Why did Jesus break this rule? And if there are exceptions to the rules, where do we stop? Where do we draw the line? Where do we end the exceptions? In Luke, how does Jesus define the rules, especially Sabbath rules? I want to go through a few examples. In Luke 4, Jesus is in hot water for preaching on the Sabbath. Later on, Luke 4, verses 31 through 37, he heals again on the Sabbath. Same hot water as today. Luke 6, the disciples are plucking grain on the Sabbath. I don't know if anybody remembers that. That's where you get the verse, Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for us, not us for the rules. Luke 6, and in the beginning of chapter 14, have 2 more Sabbath healings. What's Jesus' problem with the Sabbath? One might ask. Jesus frees us from the bondage that keeps us from walking through each day in awareness of the presence of God. Traditions and doing things the way we've always done them can become obstacles between us and God. When we focus on the rule or the tradition over God instead of God, we miss out on the wonder and the beauty of having this incredible relationship with a God who knows the number of hairs on our head, who knew us before we were born. Jesus didn't necessarily break the law. That may seem like a contradiction because he very clearly broke this Sabbath rule. Sabbath keeping is about space for God. Sabbath keeping is about allowing yourself a place to worship. Jesus interpreted this law, this rule, differently than the religious leaders, than the ones who wanted to worship the law. We don't have a relationship with God through sacraments. Next week we're going to share in communion. We're going to have the bread and the cup. And we don't enter into a relationship with God through the bread and wine. We have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ and his love for us and the atonement of his death and glorious resurrection. Not because of the power of the bread and wine, but because of what they symbolize. Now, Luke, this evangelist who gives us this gospel, had this somewhat subversive gender equality agenda. It's easy to miss if we just read the gospel through, because we can gloss over some patterns that are there. And I want to point one out to you this morning that has to do with this healing story. Most of the time in Luke, and I can go home and read Luke over and over again and try and find this, because for one thing, it would be great to have you all reading Luke over and over again. But for another, it's definitely there. But Luke counterbalances stories involving a man with one involving a woman. Always does it. Or I think almost always. There may be a couple of exceptions. But there are similar healing stories to this one in Luke 13, in Luke 14, and also the ones I mentioned a second ago. And in a male-dominant society of first century Palestine, Jesus is extending this redemptive message to everyone. He calls this woman a daughter of Abraham, elevating her to this high status. John Wesley, when he was commenting on this passage, the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley observed this, and he said, she's worth more than an ox, and an ox you take to the water to get water on the Sabbath. Ought she not be freed? And she was. Jesus healed her physically and in a spiritual sense. Jesus doesn't destroy the law. If we stop looking at the Sabbath and Sabbath rules as ones that are meant to bind us up and keep us trapped by the rules, if we stop looking at them that way and start seeing them as a way to have space with God, then we can start to see the way Jesus liberates us from the law and fulfills it. We don't forget Sunday or set it aside. And that's, after all, that's when we're here. This is our special day for worship. But there are many people who either have to or choose to work or do something else on Sundays. And regardless of whether they have to or not, the Sabbath law is about taking time to focus on God. The religious leader wasn't focusing on God, they were focusing on the rule. There are many reasons. He could have been jealous of Jesus. Jesus had a lot of positive attention at this point. They weren't ready to crucify him yet. And he had just healed somebody. Imagine that. That's a real crowd pleaser. You know, and he may have been jealous of that. But he wasn't focused on God. This passage this morning is about hypocrisy. And I think I said it a few weeks back. Every single one of us is a hypocrite. It just is a matter of to what degree. Every one of us is a hypocrite. It's just a matter of what degree. People say, I don't want to come to church because it's full of hypocrites. Come on in and join us. Be with us. Seek God with us. Be a sinner with us and recognize that it's through God that we receive redemption. We receive forgiveness. We receive restoration. Not because we're better, but because God is better. And God can do more. This passage is about addressing hypocrisy and saying, it's not the rules that you gather. That's not the reason you gather. It's God. You don't gather because of the beauty of the room or the comfort of the pews. We gather to worship. There was a Baptist church, not this one, who gathered together to vote to buy more gravel for their parking lot. The gravel was delivered. They voted yes. They ordered the gravel. The gravel was delivered. They had to call another business meeting in order to vote to have the gravel spread. It sat in a mound for some weeks until they could organize themselves, get a quorum, and vote. The vote carried. It was hot. It went through fine. But when I heard that story, another pastor, the pastor of that church, was telling me that story, an absolute frustration and exasperation. It was years ago. I think it was in my first year in ministry, and I thought, really? That's what church people want to do? Yeah, sometimes. But it seems like we miss the point sometimes. Our parking lot needs attention. That was one of the topics that came up on this last Super Tuesday of committee meetings. And I wonder what we can do. Can we do something with something so mundane as a parking lot that speaks to our community? I don't know the answer to that. But that's the kind of question we should be asking. Every little detail. How can it bring glory to God? And really sincerely ask. Pray about it. Wonder. Try to think outside the box. Jesus was always doing that. Imagine healing on a Sabbath. That's just not the way. They've never done it that way before. I can imagine somebody in the back pew saying that in the synagogue, going, I don't know about this. Sabbath and the rules are made for us, not us for them. We're here together as a family on a journey. And together we can make it. The focus of our walk is Jesus, not upholding a set of rules or laws. In each of our lives, the law might take a different shape and require different things of us. But it's all about walking closer to Christ and recognizing Him in our daily lives and in how the laws speak to us. We're not throwing the laws aside. We're looking beyond it to see the true focus, which is Jesus Christ. And together as a family, as a congregation, we run straight on toward the mark of the heavenly calling in Jesus Christ, to win the prize, which is God's call through Christ to life everlasting. Will you bow your heads with me?